Perfect. Okay, and I think we're live. So welcome everyone to this Dealroom and Sifted talk on deep tech and university spinouts. Really pleased that we have such a great crowd joining us today and a fantastic panel. I'm going to just briefly introduce in the order as people appear on my screen. So we have Riam Kanso, who is founder of Conception X, which is a not-for-profit that works with universities on, PhD students at universities on how they can sort of commercialize their the research that they're doing. Inga Deakin at Draper Esprit, specializing in health tech and using life sciences, in the creation of startups. Nathan Beniak from I've probably said your name wrong, actually, Nathan. Air Street Capital, known to many of you, I'm sure, as a long-time deep tech investor, and then also bringing in the European Commission perspective on this, Owen O'Neill, who has been working on, I think we'll hear a little bit more about this, Owen, in due course, but Innovation Radar, which is a sort of way of discovering, making or better ways to discover some of the research that's going on, in labs and other programs, as well as a number of other things that we're going to hear about later on. But everyone is really focused on this idea of deep tech discovery, which is the theme today, with this particular focus on university spinouts and how we do that better. Just to kind of set the scene, deep tech has obviously become a really big focus area at the moment. It's moved high up the priority list for many governments, and with a lot of them throwing money at various programs and looking at ways in which we can kind of highlight this, with the idea that, I think it's sort of, there's this idea that somewhere in a research lab, there's kind of Europe's Google or Europe's Tesla, and if only we could uncover it and make sure that we really smooth the path for these businesses to kind of really come to fruition, then Europe could see many more great, tech companies come forth. So, but today we're going to really talk about some of the nitty-gritty of how we can make that happen. And so I wanted to invite, without further ado, all of the panelists really at this point to kind of talk about what they think is the biggest stumbling block at the moment in terms of that really tricky lab to commercialization transition. What would you say each is the number one thing that is holding this back? And maybe if I can start with you, Riam, and then we'll go around.
Sure. Thanks, Maya, and hi, everyone. Very happy to be on this panel. So at Conception X, we're a cross-university venture program that helps PhDs launch companies, deep tech companies, based on their theses whilst they are studying. So we take them very early, and from our perspective, the first thing is a mindset change about how they can work to launch new companies, and also to change their perspective from a researcher to a founder. So we do that, and I think the mindset issue has come a long way, because I think more and more PhDs are latching on to the fact that they can use their research in quite substantial ways and to create products and services that are parts of the economy of the future. We know how big deep tech is. There is still a gap, which is the infrastructure around this, but also the early stage funding that can help them get from point A to point B, especially as it relates to quite early IP that needs a lot of support. And I think the rest of the panelists will have more to say on this matter as well.
Okay, so a little bit mentality, but a little bit also just the sort of the infrastructure. And maybe if I can come to you, Inga, for talking from a VC point of view. I mean, you're in the business of unearthing these companies sort of early on and then helping them get started. I mean, what are you sort of finding have been some of the difficulties for them, especially when you find them at that early stage?
So I know the question's about difficulties, but I'm quite optimistic that this whole field is getting easier than it was and getting more transparent because of various reasons of, programs like Riam's and other, ways of increasing transparency and awareness, I'd say. So I think So currently at Draper, we're looking more at Series A and B. So often that very early translational piece has been done before. But in my previous roles, I've worked with universities, Duke University in the US, and also Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial, UCL in the UK as a university tech transfer fund in my previous role. And there, a lot of the, to Riam's point, a lot of the challenge, or this perceived challenge at least, is in the mindset and the sort of drive of the inventor. So is it right that we expect a professor who spent their career developing a bit of technology to go and spin out a company and throw that on kind of their whole academic training to the side and try something new? I don't really think that's fair. So then you end up in a position with hired management, which is very different to a setup of a company, which is purely a founder. Do have to apologize, I've got a cold. And then you have the student end of the spectrum who then see this infrastructure, this sort of obsession with IP, with universities as a real burden. And actually, they've not spent 20 years developing a bit of technology. So why should the university have anything to do with what I'm doing? So there's somewhere in between that the vast majority of these technologies sit. So it's either based on motivation of the individual and also their skill set and recognition of where they sit in that spectrum. So I think a really important bit in this discussion is to recognize that not all of these companies or technologies are developed by the same type of academic person, yeah. Student to junior academic to professor.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No. So no one size fits all. And let's give your voice a bit of a break, Inga. Maybe I'll get Nathan to chime in there. Does that sound like you'd agree with that? Is that sort of familiar problem? What stage, Nathan, do you tend to look at companies?
Yeah, so with Air Street, I'm writing investments into pre-seed and seed stage companies, and having spent a number of years also as a PhD student in academia, I just really enjoy talking to students who are doing interesting work and have ambitions to do something different than join the ranks of an academic institution if they want to be entrepreneurs. So I do meet a lot of folks when they're still in their programs and they're just kind of toying around with ideas and just want to upskill and understand how they might envisage themselves on the path of being an entrepreneur. And then I see quite a few folks who start companies and then they try and raise their first rounds of financing. So yeah, so from my perspective, I look at this very much as like the founder is the customer, and is obviously the customer of the venture fund, but is also the customer of the university and the tech transfer office that serves them. And so if you take that point of view, I think this system's pretty broken. Like the customer's experience is bad, like pretty uniformly bad. And I don't think it has to be like that for a variety of reasons that we can get into. But I think I think we basically have like a really kind of big level setting opportunity in Europe, given the tremendous investor interest, tremendous founder interest, where the number of like talented people who worked at great tech companies are no longer necessarily building a SaaS company or a marketplace. They're doing something in bio, and that's happening more and more often than what it was in the past. So I think it's great timing to kind of address these issues.
Yeah, it'd be a good time to get it right. And I think we can dive a little bit more into exactly the ways that you think it's broken in a moment. But it'd be good to bring Owen in here, with the sort of the European Commission and maybe more pan-European perspective as well. I mean, what's your sort of reaction to those thoughts that this idea that maybe the university tech transfer system is slightly broken and that we do need to kind of find mechanisms to smooth this path a little?
Yeah, I wouldn't go so far as saying it's broken, Maya. But I think one of the big challenges can be captured in a single word: discovery. If you take an area like deep tech, be it previous breakthroughs or those we haven't yet come across in the area of deep tech, are based on breakthroughs in science and technologies emerging in laboratories.
I don't know whether everybody else is losing Owen a little bit. So
across the continent, it's work.
Yeah. Well, Owen, I'm sorry. I think we cut out.
Supporting a. Okay. Have you got me now?
Yeah, you were just a little bit in
You
and
can
out.
hear me now?
I can hear you now. So maybe if you just give us
Okay.
that last point again.
Yeah, so look, there's a breathtaking amount of public funding, be it from European programs such as Horizon 2020, Horizon Europe, or national programs. And the question is discovery. How, across these massive programs, with thousands of laboratories and researchers working, can we discover the best and most promising, or those with the highest disruptive potential innovations coming out of these laboratories? There is a universal challenge for any public funding agency, and we have our ways of trying to address that at the Commission, but we can talk about that later. But discovery, for me, in one word.
Yeah, and this is the idea then behind some of these things that you've been working on. I mean, if you could just maybe tell us briefly about TechRadar, which I think is a kind of new idea. I'm not sure what stage it's at the moment, but this was around making discovery easier.
Yeah, very simply, we want to make it easier to discover innovations coming out of the European Union's framework program, Horizon 2020, and in the future, Horizon Europe. We also want to be able to make it easy to navigate those thousands of innovations in terms of market maturity or disruptive potential. Who is behind them? What is it they are doing? How mature, etc. So we've come up with a methodology. We've been using it to scan the outputs of our projects with the use of external experts. It's not just based on self-declarations by the projects. And we've, to date, over 7,300 distinct innovations funded by the Commission through the Horizon programme have been analysed. We have a platform, InnoRadar.eu, where these can be navigated and sifted through, if you excuse the deliberate pun, in order to find innovations, be they of interest to investors, or be it a journalist, or be it a member of public, or be it a corporate, so that they can find what and who is coming out of the framework program, the Horizon program, and how mature it is. So just trying to solve in some modest way that question of discovery. It's an ongoing work. We've got the public platform, but we're constantly adding new innovations and new functionality to it.
Yeah. And is the idea, I mean, as I understood it when we spoke about this briefly before, was, it was trying to do some of that heavy lifting, because one of the problems is that often, investors, certainly people like Inga and Nathan know what they're doing, but investors who maybe don't have that same background in deep tech investing can find it difficult to evaluate sort of a particular technology, and maybe more hesitant at some of those. So was that the idea that you do a little? You can't do someone's due diligence for them entirely, but you can help them get started, I suppose.
Yeah, the intention is to point them into direction. We think considering the depth of the Commission's public funded program, but we're not the only game in town. Every country has their own public funded program. But given the depth of work that is being done in this program, that there are opportunities beyond, for example, for the investor community to find the latest breakthroughs that could be the basis of future companies that could go on to global success. So yes, we want to point them into direction, and for them to do some due diligence in due course. Nevertheless, we're working on some flanking initiatives that not fully finalized yet, but I'm happy to telegraph to the audience and to the panel that we're working on trying to see how we could support the wider research and investor communities for undertaking tech due diligence on innovations coming out of research laboratories from public funded programs, to help build that bridge and to provide some guidance, particularly maybe more for example, for angel or smaller investors who may not have the capacity or the background to do a deep tech due diligence dive. So we're working on an initiative that we're hoping to be able to publicly announce in the coming months to deliver services on a pilot scale in that very direction. A flanking initiative to the radar, let's call it.
Okay. Now I'm going to one of the things I forgot to mention at the beginning was we would like this to be a sort of two-way conversation. So if you're listening and you have some questions, please do put them in the chat, because I will be picking them up. And just to prove that this is not just me paying lip service to that, I think Timothy Barnes has put in an excellent question, which in fact chimes in very much with something I wanted to put to, especially to I think you, Nathan, and you, Owen, which is this question about the top-down versus bottom-up approach, right? So when we see a lot of these, European Commission or national government, we've seen, I don't know, France's quantum plan, or, pick one, right? There's a lot of these ones where there's a lot of money thrown at this, and it's a very top-down approach. And then I think, Nathan, you're there sort of at the pre-seed stage, I don't know, probably looking at more of a sort of need for it to be more bottom up. I just wonder, how do you think? I mean, I don't know. Maybe jump in here, Nathan. But what's your thought on kind of the big governmental approaches versus just letting things bubble up a little bit more naturally?
Yeah. Well, my read on the big kind of government subsidy and kind of R&D expansion is that of basically like nationalism and competition between different countries and wanting to just onshore capabilities, in a current like geopolitical environment, which is very anti-collaboration and much more nationalism. I've written about the importance of tech sovereignty in Europe. And if you kind of play out what sorts of industries and technologies we need to get to that tech sovereignty, a lot of that smells and looks like deep technology. So, we can throw a lot of money at the top of the funnel and, start these like $100 and whatever billion initiatives to build new semiconductor plants, or, have these national quantum strategies, et cetera. But I think we really have to fix like the bottom up. I think that's actually much more important, because for companies to actually make it to the point at which, big government can be piling in large checks into companies and buying products from them, those companies have to actually be around and like have products to sell. And so I think a lot of these startups, I mean, generally startups are extremely path dependent. And so, structural problems that get formed at day zero are very, very hard to unwind. And so that's why I kind of pay more attention to and think the bottom up strategy of fixing like the sort of process from idea from some of these grants that we're talking about that form research, and then getting those as quickly as possible for those who want to be entrepreneurs into the market with least, drag resistance or drag coefficient on them as possible, is like the best thing long-term that we can do to get to the goal that I think most people want, which is like this tech sovereignty and thriving deep tech ecosystem.
Okay, so almost the government intervention only becomes relevant at a much later stage, I guess, in your view, and the problems are probably happening at such an early stage. And I think it would be great to dig in just a moment into kind of what we think those problems are. And I see, Riam, you're nodding because I really want to ask you about kind of some of those early mistakes. But Owen, I need to give you a chance to respond to that. I mean, what's your take on the sort of the big government money and the big guns versus fixing smaller problems?
Look, speaking for the parish I know best, the Commission here, given the scale of the budgets we have at our disposal, thanks to what we're given by our member states, we have actions covering the full spectrum, from a big top-down focusing on particular verticals to get an industry moving, right through to much smaller, more targeted grants to researchers and innovators working on a very niche problem, and everything in between. So I think in the case of the Commission, we're not in one side bottom only versus top down. We're across the spectrum, and that is not by chance. That is by design. But you take the Horizon programs, be it current or future. I mean, we're going in at the ground in the innovator and research communities across the continent, and seeding researchers the very best, getting through our highly competitive processes to secure this funding to deliver breakthrough science, breakthrough technologies that we're hoping go on to have meaningful impact in global markets. Although that get that step, as we are here to discuss today, from the laboratory to the marketplace is not a trivial one.
Yeah,
exactly.
Can I jump in with an observation there as well? So I think this top down, bottom up is always a nice way to frame things, but as Owen's saying as well, that the kind of governments have to please everybody in a way, and there's different ways to approach each of those things. So maybe with this discovery project, you might really be super helpful for the corporates that are less engaged, or looking for licensing technologies, which is quite different to the spin-out ecosystem. But I think that the other three of us are kind of more focused on, and we're looking at VC type deals. So there's roles for those different programs in different ways, and one of the exciting programs I think that I've seen companies benefit from are also ways to collaborate and recognize this is all part of an ecosystem. If you put all the effort in making great spin-out companies, but there are no big corporates to collaborate with or acquire your company, or so for example, Innovate UK used to do a brilliant program where they get funding from the government that goes to an SME and a big corporate. So I was an investor in a protein purification company, which is one step in a complex manufacturing chain. So it's very hard if you go as a tiny little company and say, please, massive drug company, will you help pay for my technology? And they'll say, yeah, I'll pay for it, and then I own it. That's the end, thank you. Whereas if you get money from the government, which is kind of neutral, you can actually collaborate, build, really understand each other, start building products useful for customers without just coming from that sort of super weak position of being the startup company. So I think if we can think creatively also about ways to collaborate and foster the whole ecosystem, then that kind of creates the balance that we need to really keep it ticking. I think of that across Europe, that's not necessarily just UK. But again, I get the point about sovereignty. That's again, one of the challenges of being a government. You've got to try and please your country. But yeah, I thought that was a good example where actually collaboration is not just about one direction, it's about enabling the progression.
Yeah, and just to play devil's advocate a little bit with the two VC panelists, but that government money sometimes, in the form of those grants can be a really welcome breathing space as well for those startups who don't yet want to deal with a VC, right? That big bad VC that they might not know how to negotiate with yet, and they haven't quite figured out how it all works. So I think in a way that gives them also a little bit of negotiating power with you guys as well. If
for sure, translational grant funding and SBIRs in the US are massively impactful. It's that slightly early de-risking stage.
Yeah.
But Riam, let's dig into this kind of the sort of what can we fix and smooth out in the process, because I think I get the sense from some of the questions that people are quite interested in sort of the really grainy mechanics of this. But what are you sort of teaching when you're working with these very the PhDs wanting to turn entrepreneur? What are you telling them? What are you seeing them do? What's kind of going wrong for them?
Yeah, thank you for that, and I think I do have some perspective on the structural difficulties. So at ConceptionX, we do the very early stage work that no one wants to do, right? Because it's quite nice to deliver deep tech packaged in a startup to investors later on, but we help them kind of figure out what innovations they're working on, what sectors they're going to be in, and we train them, we team builds around them, and we build teams around them, and then they get to a stage where they can either get investment or government money. And I think just a comment on tech transfer, I think, talking about structural difficulties and the different pieces, I think one big problem is that incentives are not aligned across the different parts of this ecosystem. As you take someone who's meant to be a researcher in a lab, who's then building a product with teammates, then going through the university and then getting that. I think it's things were set up for a specific thing, and now we're expecting it to do something else, which is launch companies with students. So I think the picture of tech transfer across the UK is quite complex because each university has its own policy, and these things are usually set up for innovations that are led by professors, to what Inga said, and usually things in the medical space and where patents are involved. But something very few people I've realized know that across the UK and a lot of these universities, PhDs actually own their intellectual property. The university doesn't. Of course, there are a few exceptions with industry-funded PhDs and things like that. So I think that at ConceptionX, we decided to work with the universities, but rather than try to fix any kind of structural difficulty, bypass those in some ways so that we can get some quick wins. So with most of our winning companies in Conception X, whether it's Rocco, our quantum drug discovery company, or Turin Tech, a lot of this is student IP, which in many ways kind of bypassed the tech transfer system and those kind of lengthy negotiations. They, commercialized, they built a product, and then they got investment. And I think that we kind of were slightly ahead of the curve to do this in a very quick way and skipping a few steps across the university. But I do, to what Inga was saying, I'm also quite optimistic that things are slowly changing. I think we're being approached by a lot of universities to implement this internally. They're realizing that it's probably better to have 2% of a billion rather than 100% of nothing. So we just need to kind of work together to make a few things happen. And, between top down and bottom up, I think it's a nice way of depicting it, but many things just kind of fall in the middle as well. So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So it actually, maybe the tech transfer system isn't such a problem because you can actually just sidestep that. But
no, that's only if you're working with PhDs who are working on things that are not necessarily patentable, like software, and who do not have a university professor involved in the project. Once you add any of those complexities, this doesn't apply and you have to go through tech transfer. However, I think that tech transfer offices are usually quite busy, and they react much better to you giving them a straightforward proposition of what it is that you're building. Like, I want to do this is the business plan, these are the people involved, than them kind of getting a PhD student saying, I want to build a drug. If I do it, will you own it or will I? Like, they just,
right,
built for that. But if we do some of the work on their behalf, like, I think it's a much more productive conversation.
And is that some of the stuff that you're then doing? Is it you're kind of helping them put forward those propositions so that they can go with a ready formulated plan? And
yeah, I mean, if it's software and if it's just students, they don't need to do any of that. And then they get investments 9 months after they start the thing and they're off to the races. But if not, the point is to work with universities to make it happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is all answering Edward Owen's question, who was wondering about if there's a simple way to figure out if it's a sort of who owns the IP. So I think that's given some answer there. And I don't know, is the ownership of the IP or in general kind of the ownership structure of the startup, then does that often become a problem? And I want to bring Inga and Nathan particularly on this as well, but just wondering what your thought was on that, Rayam.
Every case is different. I think it's also about the length of time to get things out, because as you add layers of complexity on the decision making of who should do what and whatever, it goes into this, pipeline, and then someone from tech transfer goes away for 2 weeks on holiday, and then people fall out, and then people get busy, and then, it doesn't go that way. I think in general, what we're seeing is that a lot of professors are becoming more permissive with their PhDs to just get on and do it and be kind of scientific advisors rather than actively involved in the company. It's not happening in all cases, it's just happening more. And I think a lot of professors recognize that PhDs are in a pretty tough spot now. Like, there are fewer academic jobs than there are academics. They have the right to do their thing, and this is part of the jobs of the future. So in the universities we work with most, like, giving UCL as an example, or Cambridge, or, quite a few ones as well, like in the north of the UK, it's becoming, they're just pushing them out faster because they know that they can be more supportive this way and have more wins for the department and for the university. But is this across all of the UK? Certainly not. Across all of Europe? I don't think so. We're working with a nice, petri dish of very collaborative universities.
Okay. But maybe now jumping to sort of like, I just think some of those kind of early structural issues, and maybe Nathan, if I can call on you to jump into this, because I think in some of our early discussions, it felt like sometimes the very young startups were not thinking, and you referred to this even earlier, you know, they're not thinking on day one of kind of how much of the equity they should give away, who should be, you know, what kind of advisors they should have, and all of those things. I mean, what are some of the sort of, again, I don't want to call it mistakes, but, you know, like what are some of the things that you're then having to help people sort out as you start to work with them that could be avoided?
I think students come, like what we've seen is that they come in a spectrum. So they either want to give all of the equity up front, or they expect people to work with them for 3 years for free and retain everything. But, you know, I think every case is different, and I think Inga and Nathan might have more.
Yeah, well, yeah. Let's go to you, Nathan. What are you seeing in general with when you start at that pre-seed stage?
Yeah, I don't know. My perspective is a lot more dire than what Rian said. I think she deals with a lot of great people, but I don't think that's universally the case. So, I mean, what I see is like students with great ideas, and I say students, but it can be PhD, it can be postdoc, can be like double postdoc, whatever. Like they have to almost enter a knife fight with like a water pistol when they go talk to TTOs, because they just don't know what the norms are or what the process looks like. Like you can barely find what the standards are for, you know, a particular industry or a particular type of product, and what the TTO should own, what licensing terms I should have. Do I have to pay for the patent myself? How long do the terms last? Are there tiers, etc.? And then there's this extra relationship with academics, which can with their supervisors rather, which can sometimes be good and sometimes can be not so good, where you sort of end up having like this, you know, neonatal entity that gets charged hidden taxes in different directions, and by the time it's like shipped to the real world, it's like founders own 50%, and this like potpourri of various entities own the other 50%, and no one wants to fund that thing, or somebody who does want to fund that thing has to unwind everything, and that's incredibly painful. And I think that is like historically one of the main reasons why you don't see very big companies that emerge from universities, especially through TTOs, because they don't have like enough gas in the tank structurally to go the distance. And then that starts feeding this like recursive loop of like short-termism, or just like, you know, great, looks like selling my shop for 20 million to this other bigger company, and then I walk away with 1 or 2 and I'm happy. Yeah. And then you have this like real great between like, you know, institutional investors who sometimes take the risk on these companies, and then, you know, founders and academics or whatever who have that view as like that's the goal. And they're not aware that when they sell shares to a VC, like that VC is looking for a much bigger outcome than what they might think is the case. And, you know, when you're fundraising, like you're trying to build an affinity with like 2 people that don't necessarily know each other very well. So it's really hard to like have this super, you know, heart to heart and say like, what do you want to achieve? Like, when will you sell out? What is good enough? And inevitably when like, you know, dollar signs start coming, the reality like comes out, and it can sometimes look like very different from what both parties expected. Yeah. So
can you, would you be willing to
take the question?
Yes. Sorry, I'll come to you. I just wanted to press Nathan on, you know, how honest are you willing to be? I mean, how often do you walk away from something because actually it just, the structure looks like it's not workable for you?
Like very often.
Okay.
Like if at a university TTO is 30%, it's like not even worth it. Like I don't. Okay. It's like a landmine that you have to somehow very meticulously like unpick. Yeah. And
it wouldn't be worth it in any case. Okay. I think this is because I think it's really, really important for people to hear this. And Inga, does that chime with you? I mean, again, like Draper thinks like huge, right? Like, I mean, I think, isn't it one of your sort of stated aims that you only look at businesses that can kind of change the way people live? You know, it's sort of really think big stuff. So again, does that chime with you that you sort of people are pitching this too low and not thinking of the big picture?
Yeah, I was thinking about this. So yes, we're generally looking for very big opportunities. And as I said, we do come in slightly later than the kind of spin-out stage. So we kind of, usually the things that Nathan's talking about are pretty much unpicked by the time you've got to Series A. But certainly I've done some of that stuff in the past. Excuse me. So I think the question about why don't people get it earlier? Why don't the academics know what they should be looking at? How can you find out? Why is it not transparent? Because there's so many VC blogs out there now about what does a cap table look like? What are the key terms in a VC agreement? Like, there's kind of almost no excuse if you want to raise some VC money for not Googling around. There's so much resource that just wasn't there 10, 15 years ago. So I think as an industry, VC's really opened up a lot in terms of access to, how it works. And we see that translated in, well, partly as a function of more money in this sector, but also, generally more entrepreneur power, because they get it and they understand how VCs work. And I think that's a very positive thing, because you go into a better discussion and you build a relationship. I think in tech transfer, I was reflecting on that. Every time you raise VC money, you kind of have to ask those questions every time. And usually that's a couple of times within a couple of company's life. Whereas this formation bit is kind of headache of like, let's get our IP organized and, get it going. You kind of only do it once. So I think people don't talk about it as much. I don't necessarily think it's a malicious intent of tech transfer officers being very aggressive and secretive and, trying to make this some magic black box. I think it's partly a function of you kind of, you've got over that, right? Let's crack on and do all the rest of the company building. So I don't know how we can improve that kind of transparency about this project. I think this part of the sort of project development, I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, no,
I don't think it's malicious. No. It's just that TTOs have been set up structurally for a specific objective, which is like, show me an annual report with how much money you make and how many companies you spun out and how much money has been raised. Like, I think if you change the KPI from how much money you make, because frankly, it's peanuts, right? Like, it's 30, 40, 50 million pounds a year. Like, honestly, who cares? Like, the real money is in like, big donations from alumni billionaires who buy you buildings, or like money from the government, or like, big pharmaceutical companies, et cetera, who sign like, massive like, JVs and stuff. It's not like monetizing 50 million quid from some student companies. So I think right. If we change that narrative, like, I think the situation would look a lot better. And companies do what they're like, what their charter is, right?
We as the university, so it's up to the university, and it sort of depends. And you see things change within universities when leadership changes, or if it's the head of department who's super entrepreneurial, like the department I worked in at Duke, the head of that department had spun out loads of companies. Pretty much all of his PhD students go and spin out a company. So obviously he's super permissive to that kind of mentality. So I think when you say that TTOs are the customers of the TTOs are the academics, they're generally the heads of the department and the people that are there for a long time. It's quite hard as a PhD postdoc to kind of have that influence. So that is a tricky thing, who you're reporting to, who's your master. And actually, we've seen some interesting, TTOs were set up after Bayh-Dole, which was a government act in 1980, right? Something like that, where federal sponsored research, we thought the government in the US thought that they should be making some money from that. And that was all about licensing to big corporates, exactly as you said. So now all of a sudden, like, one of the stakeholders for the university is students, and students are interested in spinouts. So, we better do some spinouts. So now they're being pulled in another direction, that's an important metric. But the business school says, I don't want people to do spinouts. They don't get as much salary when they've done an MBA. So our metrics for that are not as good. So you kind of pulled in so many different directions because it's an institution that's institution by institution. And although they move slowly, they do change and leadership has an influence. So it's not necessarily easy to have a one approach. Like, we, the tech transfer community, are beholden to the masters, which is in each university. So I totally agree that if you put all the effort into a couple of massive licenses, that will check the box of you fund yourself. I mean, even better, maybe you bring in some money for the university, everyone would be happy. There's other ways to do that as well, so that some of the universities are more focused on corporate sponsored research. And again, that goes through the tech transfer office. And so they're trying to do lots of different things at the same time. So it's not surprising they're not really nailing all of them all the time, and that different universities are better at some than the other. So that's a real kind of structural issue. I just don't know how you do it. And if you've got an ecosystem where loads of PhD students want to make companies, then I totally agree. We need to be absolutely permissive. Let it, go for it. Let the TTO focus on that key professor that is going to invent 3 drugs, and that's the revenue that will fund them for the next 10 years. So, but it depends a lot on the kind of university and what you're trying to achieve.
And I'm quite conscious that we're speaking from quite a UK perspective here. I wondered, Owen, whether you wanted to jump in and give any perspective on what it looks like, across Europe. And again, is there a sort of commission role, do you think, at all to help elucidate any of that?
Yeah, I'd like to share with you an initiative in this direction that we're working on launching very soon, aligned with what I talked about earlier a few moments ago about tech due diligence services. Married to that concept, we're also associating venture building. What we're hoping to do is to launch later this year on a pilot scale venture building services, where the concept is and to bring together excellence from a research laboratory with business acumen, somebody who can take on the business side of the role, married with the third vital resource, capital, to make it happen. Wrap those three ingredients into a new venture. And now this is something that is gaining some traction in some corners in the US. These ventures that can be built, often it happens independent of any TTO. But it's not something that we've been doing at scale, if even in any widespread form in across the European continent. So we're shaping a pilot for venture building as well to be launched, we are hoping later this year, to test and to experiment with this approach. And again, going back to where I started here today, that word discovery. In order to build such ventures, we need to make it easier to discover where there's interesting things that may in laboratories that maybe have potential but are being neglected or so forth. So that's one initiative we're currently working on, and hoping to be able to give much more detailed announcement about it in the coming weeks / month. That's one concrete action.
Yeah.
So does the European Commission become a shareholder in startups?
Thanks, Nathan. No, we would not become a shareholder in these ventures. What we would do is we would just be able to seed an initiative to go and do that with EU funding, to start identifying the opportunities and bringing together the relevant business competency plus the capital, and to create new ventures based on innovations or breakthroughs that were originally funded by the EU. That's what we're. So no, not for the Commission doesn't take equity slices in business it finances. Although there is a new under the EIC, we are for the first time beginning to take equity in organisations, not directly, indirectly through a vehicle created in Luxembourg. But that's another discussion. But for what I've just spoken about, no, not about taking equity.
Nathan, what's your reaction to that? I mean, a sort of venture-built, EU-assisted venture-built startup. I mean, would that be appealing?
I mean, if it brings more like experienced commercial product kind of industry people to work with scientists, I think that's a good thing. It's a net positive. I think one of the other things that sort of spin-outs suffer from a little bit is like the sort of, even though the world is super connected, you can find all these blog posts and stuff, there's still a lot of isolationism in these different ecosystems in Oxford, Cambridge, et cetera, with various incentives as to why those kind of gates still exist. So I think, like, unfortunately, those companies don't have like an enormous pool of people to pull from at the very, very early stage. So if this kind of initiative can kind of expand that pool, that'd be really interesting. Yeah. And at the same time, I think hopefully there's people working on this program that will make their way into government departments and then start thinking like entrepreneurs in government, right? Yeah. Because I think it's hard to have bureaucrats start thinking about like how to do startups, right? Yeah.
Well, what do you think, Riam? I'd love to hear your perspective from, again, working really closely. Do you think with, the PhDs and so on, I mean, do you think they would welcome that sort of, an injection of sort of some professional advice and management?
I mean, that's what we do at Conception X.
So okay, so they'd kind of be taking your job from you.
No, not at all. I think, we can start with all of the PhDs across Europe. So obviously, a collaborative approach is what is needed. But absolutely, I mean, they need, I don't believe in a very rigid venture building formula, because that doesn't work. But they need support. They need teammates, they need mentors, they need to, the point is we don't, in Conception X, we say that we help them become venture scientists, not entrepreneurs. So we don't tell them that they need to become business people, whatever that means. The point is that we combine them with people who are good at job, and London is full of business schools, MBAs who want to be part of the deep tech ecosystem, and people from industry who have, spent 10 years at Goldman Sachs and now want to become entrepreneurs. Like, I'm not commenting on which is better, but they need that. They need training, they need support, they need a mindset change. They need, they need systematic coaching. They need help with product building. And not just that, we're talking about deep tech. So not only do they need access to equipment, they also need access to the digital infrastructure that's around that. So whether that's cloud computing, high performance computing resources, quantum resources. And I think there are lots of corporates and entities who are willing, to provide that. They need legal support as well. So we've put that in Conception X, but, and we've proved it in the UK. I think if the EU wants to chip in and use, do something similar, I think it will be very welcome. I mean, it's a lonely journey, and if they build this with the support of their university, it's just a great way to foster these innovations. Because I don't think PhDs should quit their job and go to an accelerator, quit their PhD and go to an accelerator to build the next, deep tech innovation. It really should be embedded within the research.
Yeah, it was interesting actually. You mentioned that sort of making sure, that terminology of what was it, venture scientist, because and it was partly about this not having to be a full-time role, and that it wasn't, No.
It's. I mean, if they want to build a venture, definitely it'll be a full-time role. But I think what a lot of PhDs mistakenly assume is that if they become entrepreneurs, they need to become something like Elon Musk and speak to clients and go do business development. And the reality is that for a lot of them, this isn't what they're built for. They're built the scientists, the innovators, the chief technical officer. I mean, there are tons of titles now, and it's about giving them a commercial mindset and how to think like a startup, rather than teaching them business training from 90s or something. Other people do that for them.
I think again, when we were speaking in preparation for this, I mean, the small pool of good managers or good advisors was one of those things that you highlighted. So again, I guess you're filling that role, but it would be nice to have other pools, maybe bigger pools to draw from.
Yeah,
you jump in there as well on management. I think that I've often come across at least academic inventors who said, "Oh, can you just find me some management to do that business stuff?" You think, to Riam's point, that's not really how it works. It's not a completely different thing. So training, the skill set, acknowledging what you need to build a business. This doesn't go away as the company progresses. You can be a Series B company and have 5-10 million revenue and recognize, I don't have the skill set as chief exec or whatever to scale this to 100 million. So maybe now's the time to step aside. And that is all part of that journey of building a company. And I think that self-awareness, that early idea and introduction to professional networking, which is super important in the startup world. You've got to be able to talk to all sorts of different people. If you're organizing this company, I don't think it necessarily comes naturally to academics who have a very structured way of knowing their extremely often brilliant collaboration network with other academics. But going outside of that is kind of alien. And I've been really surprised at these incredibly intelligent and sociable, great inventors who are just terrified of the unknown and kind of that networking. So if we can lower the hurdle to that, getting out there. And yes, you can talk to the head of that department in Medtronic because they would love to talk to you about this great science. Just because you're worried they're all businessy and confidential and they've got weird motivations. Lowering that activation energy or that hurdle for that mentality, I think, is super important. And whatever universities or accelerators or training can do to help that, I think, is massively valuable.
Yeah, it's interesting how you touched on that point about knowing sort of when you need to step back or step into a different role as the company progresses because you don't have the skill set to deal with it. And I feel like that's a really big hurdle actually for some people, because what we've written about a few times at Sifted is how difficult it is sometimes for people to recognize when they hit that point. And I don't know how often you see that as being kind of a thing that holds companies back. And I'm sure there's a lot of kind of war stories about having to manage that situation very gently and do that. I'd love to hear about that. But then I wonder whether there's also the opposite, where some people sort of think, well, I'm not CEO material. I don't, and to break that concept that you have to go all the way, and that would somehow be required of you. And actually, I also wonder, just to throw in another, but like whether people don't realize that there can be these more intermediate roles. I mean, I know that there's this sort of, often people are like the chief scientist or the chief technology officer, and that seems to be the role. But if again, you might be worried that you're either sort of somehow very much involved in the management in the C-suite, or you're nothing at all, and you have to sort of sell your shares and walk away from the thing that you helped bring to life.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I mean, Inga or Nathan, I'm just wondering, like, how is it something that you're kind of counseling? Again, those startups, when you start to really professionalize them, like how much of a problem that that becomes. Nathan, you look like you want to jump in.
I mean, it is. I think those are really challenging situations. I sort of have like a little bit of a cop-out answer, in the sense that, like, I make it as clear as possible for me with the founders that I pick people and we pick each other that want to be long-term managers and owners of the company, as opposed to like investing in a company which has the intention, in 6 months to go hire a CEO. I think those are different kinds of investment opportunities, which require like a pretty different approach. And at the moment, like, I bias against those. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I wonder whether we should spend a couple of minutes talking about best practice and what we'd see. We have touched on it, but I just wonder, are there things that you see sort of, happening in, say, the US or even in Asia that we could look to? Maybe. Oh, and is that you putting your hand up to say, what would you?
Yeah.
Where can we go with this? That's it.
Well, in my contribution here, I'm going to zoom out a bit. There's a fresh initiative of the European Commission which we launched in March last month, the EU Startup Nations Standard. We launched this with the support of ministers from 25 member states and Iceland from the EEA countries. The goal here is to get member states, to get the countries to start delivering startups the framework conditions that they need to start, to grow, and to thrive, and on the back of what? Best practices. I mean, there's plenty of, and we've identified 8 areas of action for where best practices. What we want to do is identify them, share them across the member states, and mobilize the member states to start implementing these best practices through their national competencies. This being in each country by country with their own policies, programs, and autonomy. Examples of the four examples of the areas that we're looking at are the ease for establishing the company. The moment of legal establishment, making that quick, easy, and cheap. Treatment of stock options. Targeting startups with public procurement budget, those massive procurement budgets that the governments are controlling. Start deliberately targeting startups to participate in those procurement opportunities. Making it easy to attract talent from third countries, bringing talent in to enrich and to help startups. So we've launched this initiative, and now we're going to set out about identifying those practices, be they within Europe or from other regions around the world, Singapore, United States, wherever, and to get the countries working on implementing them with a view to securing, let's call it, the EU Startup Nation Standard. So that's okay. That's, as I say, I zoomed out to share that with you, but it's something we've recognized as being very important, and we're working now very closely with the vast majority of member states and Iceland to make this happen.
Okay, so that's good. That's. I wonder whether well, Nathan, you're unmuted for the moment, so jump in and
yeah, I can take the micro view. Yeah, so like from my point of view, I think the industry, especially with spinouts, can benefit a lot from standardization. I honestly like don't really buy the argument that every spinout has to be different and therefore has to be bespoke, has to go through a bespoke negotiation process. So what I would propose is that basically we develop a sort of like simple agreement to spin out, like basically, you know, a safe style investment agreement, right? Which basically sets out like the TTO gets a choice of either a specific small range of equity. We can debate as to whether that's at the start or perhaps like just like a 1% on the exit, or licensing rate on net sales, which would, you know, reflect the sort of two different paths of value accretion in a company, if it's a biotech or if it's a software company. And then you basically get like universities to task the TTOs to maximize the number of startups created under this SaaS, with a commitment to say you do this in 3 months. Like no kicking and screaming. And then third, I think you really invest in this concept of alma mater, which I think is entirely non-existent in Europe, but is so important in America, and is like the reason why American endowments have hundreds of billions of dollars in size, and in Europe we have, I don't know, 50 times less than that, and even less that's donated by alumni. So you start this like very long-term journey of making sure that, you know, when students join universities, they join this community. It's like a long-term thing. The community's there for them. It supports them. You know, it funds their education. They fund it back, etc. It's not like a utility that you pay for and then you don't care about. And I think long-term, if you then incentivize tons of companies that get created, their terms are great. So they're more likely to go the distance. They're more likely to get funding. They're more likely to become wealthy. They'll pay it back to the university. And then we start to kind of untangle all these like structural problems that we currently have. And then you'll see like whichever country or university sorts of adopts this fastest, you'll just see like a flight of talent, of entrepreneurial talent to those universities. And they will end up recruiting the best students because the best students want to work with those kinds of individuals. And then everybody else is going to have to emulate.
Yeah, that's a nice vision. What about you, Inga? You obviously have worked with a lot of the US universities as well. Again, are there elements like that we could bring over here?
Yeah, I think that's the ambition for a streamlined, you know, much faster, more predictable process is absolutely, you know, would be super helpful to help, you know, make this move faster, be more predictable. I agree with the statement that it doesn't need to be one size fits all for every single company, but I do think there is some need for kind of grouping. You know, one size fits all for a PhD, no significant IP is going to be quite different to this is a 12 patent package that the TTO has invested in over the last 5 years, and, you know, paid for consultants, and, you know, that it's not just turning the handle, it's not just paperwork in a TTO, at least, you know, the sort of more active ones. So I do think there is an element of at least making some buckets to make that super streamlined, and definitely in the kind of deep tech software, less really IP is less of the value, honestly, in the long term of the business. Then absolutely standardizing and making that streamlined as possible is very appealing. I think the point about alma mater is, I would love that. And I turned up to Duke University, everyone's wearing Duke sweatshirts, you know, for the rest of your life. Everyone that drops off a kid there has got a Duke mom sticker in the back of the car, Duke grandmom, great Duke grandpa. The baby's got it, the dog's got an outfit. I mean, it's incredible. The brand of these universities is, I just don't feel I can walk around in my Cambridge jumper where I left in 2004 and with the same, you know, chutzpah as you just do in the States. Culturally, it's so different. And a big part of that is, I had a kid in the States. As soon as I had a kid, people were asking me about investing in my college fund. Like, he's not even a toddler yet. It's just such a different kind of mentality. And a big part of that is because you pay, in most cases, a ton of cash, even if you're within state. It's a massive investment for your whole family. So unfortunately, I think, you know, having been there, I really appreciate that value of the university, and I've been fortunate to be at great universities in the UK, you know, Oxford, Cambridge, brilliant brands, and, you know, incredibly proud of that. But still, culturally, I'm not going to walk around in my Cambridge hat. I'm just going to feel like it's just not a thing yet. So I totally agree that building great relationships with alumni is crucial, and I was in fact involved in an undergraduate in doing that, setting up a system for people, recent graduates, to give 10 quid a year is one of the things we set up within my college, just to keep that connection. But ultimately, you're right, the big checks come from some crazily successful person that had a good time, and the development officers that are doing that in universities. I think they're getting better, but it's culturally quite different. But within this niche of entrepreneur, do you want to look back at your interaction with the TTO and be happy about it? Yeah, absolutely. So I think particularly specifically if you've developed IP, or your success is linked to your university, very directly in that way, then absolutely, please remember that, as opposed to that difficult transition that you had to spin out. But I just don't know the way that you could change that whole cultural piece of the university connection. I think it would have to be in this stream. But I would, absolutely.
Well, maybe Riam has some thoughts on. I mean, what's on your wish list to change? And maybe you can answer part of that. Sort of what are the sort of small things we could change, now without.
Oh, it's not a small list, but I think with deep tech, right, it's going to take some time, but it should be a collaborative effort between universities, government, private sector as well. And I think also as speaking from Conception X's perspective, we've built something that works. And I think, more contributors and collaborators kind of working with us to spread this across the UK is necessary. Government funding is important. We're a zero equity program, and we're a not-for-profit as well. So it's really to the university's benefit to make this happen. And I think, putting programs like this, I'm speaking from Conception X's perspective, but I do believe that having programs like this in more universities and universities working together can really do that initial step that no one wants to do. And also universities being a bit more collaborative, because every university has its own program, Imperial has 2, Oxford has however many. And the point is not for the universities not to see this as, their own thing that they need to keep inside and not collaborate with others. So I do think cross-university initiatives should work in that sense. As for the TTO offices, I agree with Inga. I think having buckets so that people can know what the rules are is important. I think some universities have started doing that. UCL started the Portico Ventures program, where there are 2 categories of things. Imperial has its own. But I think by no means does it cover the whole spectrum of options, and there's still a little bit of witchcraft in deciding, where you fall. And there are deals done, behind the table, and some people being well, are you an advisor? Or let's get this out. I just don't think that should happen, because it's counterproductive for everyone. But yeah, I think that those are my comments at the early stage.
Yeah. No, it sounds like it's there are some really concrete things though. I do feel like there's this idea of the buckets and the more transparency on what a standard deal would look like. I mean, these could be things that could be done. I don't say easily, but they could be actioned. And then sort of the other things about the bigger cultural changes that you think about, and I'm not sure, Inga, whether we're going to make UK or European universities be culturally the same as American ones. Those might be more difficult ones, but I feel like what feels hopeful is that there's some sort of small concrete things, and as Owen has told us, there's also these EU initiatives which are coming, and it'll be interesting to see what kind of difference those start to make as well. So lots to watch. I'm afraid we're at the end of our time. We've had a lot of good observations. Sorry if we haven't managed to answer all of your questions. We've tried to fit some of them into the discussion. And thank you everyone for being such an active audience. And so just a very, very big thank you from me to Riam, Inga, Nathan, and Owen for coming on today to discuss kind of a really fundamental issue. So join us again for more talks later.
Thanks,
Thank you, Maya. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.